Well, it's good to have all of you here. It's our last meeting together. It's that fast, huh? The whole semester has just flown by. So next week, you'll have a take-home exam. Open book? No, open Bible, not open book, right? All right. Why don't we open with a short devotional this afternoon? An area that is often missing when we talk about ethics is the area known as friendship. Friendship. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his very famous book on ethics called Nicomachean Ethics, has a whole chapter on friendship. And I read one of the editions, and the translator said it shouldn't be there at all, because friendship sounds like a very deeply personal thing. It shouldn't be in ethical deliberation. But I think he's wrong, because Aristotle and many who have come after him would agree that it is our friendships that also affect who we become, how we bounce ideas off one another, and how they shape us and how we shape them. And today, for our devotional, I want to use one example of that. All of you, I think, know John Newton's famous hymn, Amazing Grace, right? Now, many do not know that he was collaborating with someone else. One of the greatest English poets in the 18th century, also known as William Cowper. And when he first met John Newton, he was an unknown. He was an unknown guy. He suffered bouts of depression and tried numerous times to kill himself. His marriage wasn't so good. So John Newton, by this time, he was once a slave trader. Now he was a pastor. And William Cowper came alongside, stayed next door to him, and that friendship changed the both of them. In fact, both of them collaborated on a hymnal, and it was because of their relationship that many biographers would say led also to the writing of Amazing Grace. Where they were, that area was known as Olney. So today, if you check the internet, you just type in Olney hymns. It was a hymnal that was put together by the both of them, and one of the hymns that comes out of that place is Amazing Grace, right? So they changed each other. They challenged each other's spirituality. They challenged each other's relationship with God, and both ended up a lot better as a result of that. Now, what I want to do is to say a little bit about William Cowper, and when we close this afternoon's class, I want to close it with John Newton himself. Okay, so William Cowper, as I said earlier on, struggled with intense bouts of depression, and it is interesting because one Sunday, when John Newton was preaching, William Cowper, after the sermon, sensed the depression crawling back into his soul. And I think for those of us who struggle with that, you can sense when the impending darkness is beginning to come in. So he was actually, just after the sermon, he was now in the middle of the fields on the way back home. So you know what he did? Because of the experience of it coming in, so he was familiar with it already. It was coming, encroaching into his mind, heart, and spirit. He quickly ran home. The depression is coming. The depression is coming. I'm going to feel very suicidal very soon. So he ran all the way home and quickly penned a poem. He quickly penned that poem so that when he reached that point of depression, he would be able to read what he wrote while his mind was still clear, so that while he was in the midst of darkness, he would be able to read it and remind himself who God is. And that poem became a hymn, and it became a very famous poem. Many of us know the first line of that poem. God moves and works in mysterious ways. Right? You've heard that expression. It comes from William Cowper. But many do not know the rest of the poem. When you read it and you go through those lines, you see the incredible hope and desire to encounter the sunshine of God. Right? So he knew where he was already heading towards. So let me take a read at this. Okay? God moves in mysterious ways. Why he lets me have this depression, I don't understand. His wonders to perform. The reason God works in mysterious ways is in order to perform his wonders. So when someone says to you one day, God works in mysterious way, you can finish the line, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. In spite of the storm that I'm in right now, God is above it and he'll pull me out. Failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds that you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break. The clouds will fall away at some point in blessings on your head. I like the next stanza. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense. With our weak feelings, don't use that to judge God, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err. Whatever I don't believe in God, whatever I'm doubting, that is usually mistaken. And scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain in due course, right? So even though that relationship with John Newton was at times so painful and difficult, right? Without John Newton, William Cowper wouldn't be the person and the poet that he became. And without William Cowper, John Newton wouldn't be that wonderful music writer that he was also. So that's the gift of friendship, that which to cultivate, but also in the context of the grace of God. All right, our final lecture day. Let's see. I only started including this section this year in my ethics class because I realized that talking about character and moral formation is seldom addressed in seminaries now. In fact, it's seldom addressed in church also. Why? Because it sort of goes against our Protestant notion of justification. Because in our minds, if we are saved by grace through faith alone, what is this thing about moral formation? Because moral formation feels like it is works. But that is not how even the Reformers understood it. In fact, that is not even how the early church understood it. Character and moral formation came alongside the gospel. It was part 2 of conversion. So I thought I'd just deal with some of this just in case some of us may have questions about does moral formation or constructing a deeper character in very specific areas in our lives go against a doctrine of grace. So I will deal specifically with that issue. And secondly, why is character and moral formation important? Because it is the heartbeat of our ethics. If you really think about it, if your character is compromised, you can talk about all the ethical principles you want in this class. You can talk about the ideals about abortion, for example, the ideals of capital punishment, the ideals of some of the issues we've talked about in this class. But all the ideals about all of those theories makes no difference if you do not have an inner character to pull it off, right? So it would be putting the cart before the horse in a sense. So another reason for talking about moral formation is because for many Protestants, we have no vocabulary for how to get there. We talk about Christ-likeness, for example. How to be like Christ. In fact, you can go to church or sometimes in seminary, be like Christ, right? You hear that. Or Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. But how do you get there? Sounds nice, right? Spiritually, it sounds wow, very inspirational. Be like Christ. Next question, how? What am I going to do every day? You know what I mean? What are the steps to get there? This is called moral formation. Okay? So, the questions we're going to ask. What is character formation? How is it related to grace? Because many Christians, I realize, struggle with that issue, right? If I'm saved by grace, why do I have to work so hard in certain areas of my life? I mean, isn't there a conflict? So because of that, we have different responses. I just trust the Holy Spirit. But what does the Holy Spirit do? I don't know, magic somehow, you know. We don't have a vocabulary to pinpoint specifics in our lives, right? So just so you know that there is a history in our own tradition, the Christian historical tradition or the Judeo-Christian faith that deals specifically with moral formation. And then we will talk about, finally, how do we get it and acquire it, okay? And then in the second half, when we come back later on, we'll ask the question, is character also formed socially? Where you are born, where you are raised, how does that affect character? Just so that you can be more self-aware and learn to spot these things. Especially if you're going to be a pastor or you're going to counsel someone. How do you spot these kinds of things? The overriding influence on a person's character. Okay, so we'll talk about that later on. All right, let's begin with the first one. What is character formation? Let me begin with this. I've always been puzzled by the problem of why some Christians grow and others don't. Have you all asked those kinds of questions? Some show up in church, some look very serious, some grow, and sometimes the serious ones look serious in one season and they don't grow. You wonder, what happened? How come? What accounts for Christian growth in some people, and for others, they don't grow at all? Okay, here's the point I put in your notes. Let me state it and I'll explain it. Maturity and inner transformation is not automatic. No matter how dramatic and life-transforming our spiritual conversion. Okay? Maturity and inner transformation is not automatic, no matter how dramatic your conversion was. Okay? In other words, no one grows without choosing to grow in the long term. The qualifier is long term. You can grow in the short term, but in the long term, no one grows without choosing to grow. No one matures without choosing to mature. Let me give you a quick illustration of this using the phenomenon of a heart attack. Okay? Think of the experience of a person who has just had a heart attack. What happens to a person? I mean, if you've talked to those who've been through heart attacks, they have what? Chest pains, painful heaviness in the center of the chest, shortness of breath, and the symptoms can be different. But those who are undergoing it or having it encroach upon their hearts know that something is wrong. Others have heart palpitations where the heart is beating irregularly, discomfort in both arms. I mean, those are the characteristics, right? Lightheadedness, sweating, sense of impending doom. In severe cases, the heart actually stops beating. So what happens? We call 911, okay? And then the doctors or the paramedics try to revive us. So what do we know about something like this phenomenon? 50% of the people survive it, 50% don't, right? Or thereabouts. For those who survive, it is a life-changing experience. it is a life-transforming experience. Why? Because you feel as if you're really going to die. It's dramatic. And we are grateful for those of us who are the 50% who actually survive a severe heart attack. We will always remember that dramatic experience because it was a deep experience. But here's the point. What else changed after the heart attack? You are grateful that you were saved, literally, from a heart attack, right? But here's the problem. What else changed? Nothing. Your cholesterol is still dangerously high. Your blood pressure is still dangerously high. Your lifestyle is dangerously sedentary or inactive. Your eating habits are still dangerously putting you in waiting for the next heart attack. So this is important to understand. Okay? Does the life-changing experience of being saved from a heart attack change any of those other areas? No, they don't, right? In fact, saving us from a heart attack does not change our cholesterol, your blood pressure, because you have to ask what led to that in the first place. The hundreds and thousands of small choices that we make every day, the actions and habits over the weeks, months, and years of our lives that brought us the high cholesterol and high blood pressure has not changed. Okay? I couldn't think of a better illustration, actually. So even after being saved, right? The cholesterol problems are still there. The behavioral problems are still there. The lifestyle issues are still there. And you already know where I'm going with this. When we are converted, right, to the faith, it is real and it is life-changing. And you remember it because it is deep and it is real. But our spiritual conversion does not touch many of those other areas of our habits. You see the problem? Your cholesterol habits have not changed and all of that. Our old habits continue on. Our wrong thinking continues on from our previous lives. Our unhealthy and default settings and emotions from the past continues on. Those have not changed. Our prejudices continue. Our sins from the previous life continues, even though you deal with a few, right? So, what do we know? We see this also in the life of the disciples of Jesus. Proximity to Jesus does not guarantee maturity. That's the scary part. Proximity to Jesus does not guarantee maturity. I mean, that is the reason why it is possible for some who come to church and say, I love Jesus, and then boom. You wonder what happened to them a few months later or a few years later. Because conversion does not guarantee transformation of character. All right? The reality is, you can even have a person like Judas walking in close proximity to Jesus and still betray him in a very phenomenal way. Right? Proximity does not guarantee character transformation. So from this, we learn at least three things. Three things. First of all, we said it earlier on already, spiritual conversion, however dramatic, does not automatically change our old ways of thinking, our old habits, and our old ways of living, like I just said. Secondly, maturity is something we choose. It is not automatic. Thirdly, now this one is the qualifier in all of this. Many of us thankfully have picked up wonderful character habits along the way. And there are two ways to understand this. In your notes, I put down there tacitly and consciously. Some of you have picked up tacit habits because you come from families who, let's say, value certain things like hard work, perseverance, or families who were Christians and they grounded you in certain kinds of spiritual habits already. So, without thinking, you already learned that there are some habits that are important for you, but you don't know why they were important. They seem like the normal thing to do, right? Simply because you were in an environment that valued those things. For example, being generous, thinking about the poor. So you've been generous for a long time because your family taught you that. or because you were in a particular environment. But if you were to, someone would ask you, why do you do that? It's a normal thing to do. You cannot even explain it, but you've always done it. Like maybe learning musical instruments, right? It's the normal thing for you because you were in a particular environment. That is called tacit learning or tacit character. In fact, a lot of the Bible refers to that kind. When your children are brought up, train them, train them. That is actually tacit learning. It's not that your children said, hey, mom, dad, I want you to teach me how to have a strong character in my emotional life. They don't tell you that. It's the parents who give it to them as a gift, right? That's tacit learning or tacit character. The second one is the conscious one, where you say, hey, you know what? I really have got serious anger issues in my life, and every time I have a problem, I just seem to be disproportionately emotional to the size of the problem. I better deal with that. See, when you deal with that kind of problem, those are the conscious versions of character. Unlike the first version, which is the tacit version, the second one is the conscious version. Okay? So, the third point, as I just said, is that there are many habits that we pick up tacitly. So, if you have certain good habits, and all of us grow up with certain amounts of those, thank God for those, thank the families that you have for those. Okay? All right, so I put there in your notes then what character and moral formation is in your notes. Character formation then is the process and means by which the grace promised to us by God becomes slowly established into our inner core, into our deepest places, into our motivations, and into our thinking, and into our subconscious, the bad spelling there, into our natural responses, and into the foundations of our hearts, until, and here's the key point that you're going to hear throughout this afternoon, until it becomes second nature. Okay? You all know what the first nature is. The first nature is your basic anthropology, your survival skills, your adaptation. You know, someone scares you, you have fight or flight responses. Those are first nature. Second nature are the things that you learn along the way until it becomes a second part of you. That's the expression, second nature. Some people, for example, are more forgiving than others. They just tend to be more, they let things go a lot easier than others because they practice that a long time, or it's been so, that is so natural to them in their belief system as well as habit. So after a while, they just seem to forgive far more easily than other people. See, that's second nature. That's not first nature, because it is in our first nature to hit back. You see how it works, right? First nature, second nature. So character is second nature. Okay? Any questions so far? Any comments so far about how character works? I'm just trying to use different illustrations to get to the core of what character formation is. Okay, the next point. Without developing a grace character, we unknowingly block and severely limit God's already present and future blessings from entering our lives. That's simply a big way to say, for a person who follows God but chooses not to develop character, the lack of continual growth actually prevents even future blessings from entering into our lives. Okay? Sometimes we don't realize that one. So let me use an illustration to try to paint a picture of what this looks like. Suppose you have a billionaire father who has a big company, who's trying to groom his son to hopefully one day take over this company, or son or daughter, okay? But the wise father also knows something about character formation. I cannot just hand over my inheritance to my child or daughter. Why? Because if I was to give away billions of dollars, right, with the extravagant money and amount of money, it will create what? An entitled spirit in the child. And this child is going to be arrogant. That will undoubtedly destroy not just the company but my child, right? Because money can bless, but money can also destroy because of the power inherent in it. Secondly, the father, a wise father, is afraid that by handing over billions of dollars just like this, it will create a lazy spirit, right? Because then the child will know, oh, any problems I have always money to the rescue, instead of finding creative ways to deal with it or character ways to deal with a problem. There's always the easy answer of the money. And the father knows this. And the father also knows that it will take time, trials, and being apprenticed by life's trials and all that, to cultivate respect, love, manage, and deeply understand the people in the company who don't have that kind of money. How do you manage people you don't understand one day, right? So the question is, will the billions of dollars destroy the child's character if given too soon, right? So now the son or daughter, right, imagine, goes into the company and knows that the father is rich. And the child says, Father, I have all of these very difficult people around me. If you are so rich, why don't you just fire them? Instead of them making life difficult for me, you are the boss, we've got the resources. Just fire them. But the wise father will say, how will you ever learn how to love your enemies? Or deal with conflict, right? If I fire them. It's too easy. How will you then learn how to be wise and navigate difficult relationships? Or secondly, the son is, or the daughter is asking, Father, why must I start from the bottom of the company? Right? If I'm so special, at least let me begin in the middle or at the top. If you have all of that, why must I suffer so much? And the father says, how then will you understand the job and the people you are managing? You need to go through what they are going through to understand what they are going through. Or to put it in a different way, we appreciate more the things we work hard for. Okay? What else? Father, why don't you spotlight me, put me in the center so everybody knows who I am, instead of keeping me in the shadows? Because I'm going to make important decisions. People need to know who I am. And the father says, how then will you know how to be humble and wise? Right? Where you influence people instead of commanding people. It's two different things. To command versus influence is different. Okay, so I want you to notice something there with this illustration. The inheritance is already given, actually, to the boy or the girl. The inheritance that has been promised, in a sense, is already given. That was never the question. Right? Similarly, at conversion, it was never a doubt that when God says in Romans, for example, my inheritance is yours. It talks so much about inheritance, right? Everything on earth, heaven, it's yours. But you see, you and I are not ready to receive the rest yet, because we don't have the right character to appropriate the rest of the billions of dollars in blessings, right? So you can see the hints towards grace already. Your second nature character does not earn his blessings. Actually, the blessings are all given, but they are given in staggered ways. Okay? That our cultivation of character and moral development does not earn God's love or God's inheritance, because it's already given to us. In other words, even before the father chooses to give the rest of the billions of dollars, in fact, the entire company, the father already loves the child and intends to give. That was never the question. So the argument that, why do I have to cultivate character? That's not grace anymore. Does not understand the nature of grace. Does it make sense? It's already given, but I do not have the character yet to receive the rest of it. So, in your notes, developing a grace character then is a decisive response to the extravagant and generous love of God that in turn prepares us to receive more grace ahead. Okay? And we'll talk about the verses that point to that later on. Okay, so now, any questions so far? Next one. How then is character related to God's grace, more specifically? Because when we start looking into the Bible, we notice a few things. And this is when Christians theologically don't quite know how to navigate. are the things that teach Jesus, Paul, or Moses, the things that they tell us, are they rules, commands, prescriptions, suggestions? What are they? On the one hand, we say we live by grace and not by the law. Correct? But are the law, is that intended for us for moral formation? Are we supposed to follow them or not follow them? What do you all think? Are the things Jesus teaches us too, you know? A new command I gave, so the old ones are abrogated. I mean, what? Deleted? Right? Do you see the conflict many of us have in our heads? We're not sure. That's the point. So we pick and choose. That's the reality. We pick and choose. Well, so rules, commands, suggestions, or to not complicate issue, forget it. I live by grace, so I don't need to follow any of those things. See how it works? Because we don't quite know how to situate those things in our lives, right? So, here's how we understand it. Here's how the church has understood it throughout our church history, both on the Judeo and the Christian side. Okay? They operate in at least 2 or 3 levels. That is why, depending on which level you see them, they can be interpreted differently. The first one, you see them as initial guidelines to keep us on track. So let me use illustrations just to make them easier to understand, okay? When I say initial guidelines to keep us on track, what do we mean by that? Okay, imagine when the local authorities in San Diego, they try to build a freeway, right? Now, what do they assume when they build a freeway? They assume that you know how to drive. Or they hope you know how to drive, right? But just in case you don't quite know how to drive, or the weather's bad, or you have a bad car, right? What do? They build a barrier in the middle in their design, right? But the point is to not go as close as possible to the barriers that separate one side from the other side. What else do? They build rumble strips on the ground. So when you're going too far to the left or too far to the right or crossing lanes unnecessarily, your car starts to rumble because they intentionally put those strips in there, right? So what are those strips? After all, you're supposed to know how to drive. You're not supposed to be crossing lanes or going over to the other side. But why are those things intentionally put there? That's why I use the word initial guidelines. Because just in case you don't really know how to drive in certain inebriated moments, you get drunk or falling asleep, whatever it is, in those moments, it's already been built into the system that you don't kill too many people, including yourself. It is to protect you. Let me give you an example of that biblically. When you read James operates in that way. Why? If you understand the genre of James is the pastor. What does he do? James has no time to develop theology, like Paul, right? He is the pastor. So what does a pastor do? Pastor, if you are dealing in a situation where your people are getting persecuted, left and right, some are dying for their faith, what do? And then there are rich people coming in to take advantage of the not so rich. You issue emergency statements. You're not developing theology. You are telling them, hey, you rich guy or rich gal, stop it. Don't do that. What about you guys with your tongues? You're gossiping, you're destroying other people's lives. James has no time to tell people, hey, do you know the theology of speech? Like from Proverbs, right? He has no time to develop all of that. He is in an emergency pastoral situation telling people not to hit the guys coming on the other side of the freeway. That is called an emergency situation. That's an emergency theology, right? But that is not necessarily to tell you how to become a better person, but it shows you the ideals at the same time, right? So that is what we call the initial guidelines, but that is only the first step. when you understand the rules in the Bible, all right? Because the point of James, when you compare him to Paul, for example, as I said, for James, he has no luxury to develop an overly deep reflective theology like Paul. Okay? He deals with emergency pastoral issues. So here's the point. You cannot be a good driver just focusing on the barrier alone. Okay? You have to be a far better driver than that. When you drive on a car, your parent tells you, or if I become a parent to my child, teaching him how to drive, my first lesson is, don't hit the barrier. Wow, that's a really lousy way. That's not the point. That's the worst case scenario. Don't confuse an emergency situation with normal situations. Okay? But you know what? For many Christians, just starting out on the journey, you need to give them these kinds of emergency rules. When a person is just starting out. Okay? Those who don't understand the history of the faith, those who have no background in spirituality, you begin with these kinds of initial guidelines. Don't do this. These are the things to do. Don't. But remember, those are only starting points. Okay? So many of the rules and laws function at that level, but not only at that level. Okay? Because we move on now. Many of the rules, laws and commands in the Bible, they function also as roadmaps and the destination. Not just initial guidelines for the new Christians, but they become road maps as well as the destination of where your character is supposed to go. And again, I'm going to give you some examples. Okay? So, let's just say you are an angry person in the church and Pastor James, the epistle, right? He meets with you, the brother of Jesus, right? He meets with you and you are angry with your other brother and you want to kill him. You want to take out his entire family, right? What am I going to teach you? The first thing I'm going to say to you is, whatever your name is, you know, as a Christian, learn to forgive your enemies, right? What does that do? It gives you both an initial guideline as well as a road map. An initial guideline as well as a road map. Why? Because clearly the person probably doesn't have it within himself to even forgive. You know how damn difficult it is to forgive if you've never been trained in forgiveness? So you're giving him a road map into, this is who we eventually become more by second nature. But for now, this is an initial guideline at the same time. This is what you need to understand. Okay? So, guidelines take place in the meantime. While you are where you are right now, this is what God wants to give us to help us along the way. Right? Because if you leave people without guidelines, they don't know what to do in the Christian faith. But remember, there are guidelines for starters, but there are also roadmap to who we later become over a period of time. Okay? So it's the destination, but no one becomes forgiving and loving in one season. So it takes a while for us to get there. Right? Okay, so any questions about that? And later we will illustrate with even more illustrations. Okay? Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the next one, Aristotle and Jesus, because if you are wondering if character formation and moral formation sounds like virtue ethics, it is virtue ethics. Okay? Remember what we talked about in virtue ethics? It's not about how to solve problems. You focus on who you become. Because as virtue ethicists like Aristotle and many today like Stanley Hauerwas and others, they would say, all the ethical class you take is not going to change a person's decision in the moment of decision or moment of emergency, because the decision has already been made. By the thousands and thousands of decisions they've made up to that point, it's going to determine under pressure what they are already going to do at that moment. Okay? So, now we work backwards. Then, what kind of person should we become? That is why we are talking about moral formation. Now, some people say, maybe that's too Greek. Maybe that's too Aristotle. Well, yes and no. Right? Because Aristotle did teach the same thing. except that what he considered as character in many instances would not be the same thing Jesus would consider as character. Let me give you some examples. Let's see. Humility. Among the Greeks, humility is not a virtue to aspire to. There's no need to be humble. Okay? That's an example, right? Love, kindness, and forgiveness, for example, was not rated very highly by Aristotle or the Greeks. But Jesus puts that there, right in the center. Love, forgiveness, humility. So in your notes, I just put a few points over there, the differences between Aristotle and Jesus. In Aristotle, character is based on following moral commands dutifully. You know, it's all obligation and duty. But under grace character, it is a response to God's generous love. Okay? Very different motivation. What else? In Aristotle, it is all about you. Under grace, it is by giving yourself to God and to others that you discover genuine human existence. You gain your life by losing it. How you get it is very different. The way to get there, right? What else? Now this one is more of a technical point. In Aristotle focused on happiness or human flourishing as the goal of cultivating character, because even Aristotle realized the same thing that we talked about earlier on. You cannot be a flourishing and even a happy person if you don't have character. Because let's just say the situations in life go up and down, and your emotional life is a fluctuating one. What that will do is to take your emotional life up and down instead of having a heart that knows not to depend on certain emotions at certain points in your life. That is why you need character to even become a happy person, right? So the difference is character in the Western tradition has focused on happiness, but character in the Christian tradition has focused on blessedness. Okay? They are very different. What is blessedness? Remember, the first sermon Jesus gave, right? On the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, in Luke, the first sermon is in Luke chapter 4, where, what's the first words of Jesus? I have come to set the captives free, right? In the first sermon in Matthew chapter 5, what does Jesus begin? In Luke, it begins with hope. In Matthew, it begins with blessed are you. That's a blessedness. And what is blessedness? It's too big a word to translate. But blessedness includes happiness, but it is far bigger than happiness. In fact, some translations translates the words blessed are you in Matthew 5 into happiness, but they kind of miss a lot. So blessedness includes happiness, but it is a lot more than that. It is a person who, being united with Jesus, receives the favor of God, the blessings of God, and the transformative power of God. Now, don't know whether to do this, but let's do it. The Sermon on the Mount, because in a sense that ties into what we are saying. Is that a command? You know, if you read the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, first you read the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are you. If you keep reading, it gets quite heavy. If your right eye causes you to sin, if you lust, pluck it out, because you're already lusting, right? Stealing, the standards of Jesus are so high. Okay, let me ask you a question then. I mean, just to throw out possibilities. Is that a command to follow? Or something not to follow? How would you interpret those difficult demands? You all know what I'm talking about, right? The Sermon on the Mount, right? If you covered over something, that is already stealing. If you lust, that is already committing adultery, right? Is that for us to follow? Is that a command that is applicable for today? What's your response? Anyone? Or because we believe in grace, we don't follow law? How you answer that one will help you understand moral formation. Anyone? Yes, Chuck.
The way I've seen it is it's a hyperbole.
Right.
How does a hyperbole
Okay.
teach us important principles?
Okay, so it is a teaching. It's a teaching tool, but hyperbole is an exaggeration. So what is the message then? What, because if it is an exaggerated way of teaching, what is the teaching, you think?
Which one are you talking about?
The Sermon on the Mount. You say it's a hyperbole, right? Hyperbole means an exaggerated form of teaching. But what is he teaching? Is it something to follow? Is it binding? Maybe that's the word to use. Is it binding on us today? Must we follow it? Or do we not follow it? Or is it an option?
I think we're called to follow it in principle.
Called to follow in principle. Meaning what? Can we not choose to follow it? In other words, is it a command? You see the difficulty? If it's not a command, why does he say it? But if he says it and we cannot follow it, what's the point? You see the philosophical, logical contradiction there? Okay, anyone else? Okay, Amy first.
Well, I think he sets the bar so high and says, okay, you need grace in order to get there. You can't do it on your own. I think this is the point.
So it has nothing moral about it. It is simply to tell us we can't follow the standards of his standard. Is that it? Okay, that is Luther's position. It's, by the way, it's known as the impossible standard. Okay? Position. Right? Anyone else? Okay, so to clarify that position, Jesus wants to show us what his standards really are in order to lead us to him, because it's just too much to follow. None of us will make it by the law. Right? Okay, so that is the impossible standard approach. Yes, Darren.
I think it's both and. I think it's Luther's impossible standard, but I think it's also a command using her hyperbole to stress the seriousness of lust, or to stress how serious that is to God.
Right. And Jesus goes through a long list of the impossible things. Or is it possible? See, if you were a Wesleyan, right, Wesley, they have something called Christian perfectionism. It is possible to be perfected in this world. Right? Go to Westmont College and they'll be teaching you that in the seminary there. Okay? So, can you tell the multiple interpretations to this? All right. Here is one way to respond to it. In fact, it's been interpreted in so many different ways. Some say that it is an emergency ethic for the apocalyptic times. Some have interpreted it in those ways. There are pretty much 4 different interpretations to the Sermon on the Mount. Google the name of this guy, Joachim. It's not Joachim because he's German. On the Sermon on the Mount, okay? I found his interpretation one of the most compelling. Why? Because as a New Testament scholar, he and Dr. Brown may or may not agree. Okay, I'm not sure. I never asked her about this one. He wrote a very small book on the Sermon on the Mount, and he made a distinction between what is it? Greek. Didache, okay, versus okay, I don't know the Greek word, I forget, it'll come back to me later. It's proclamation. Right? I forget the Greek word. It'll come back. All right? Jeremiah looked at the Sermon on the Mount and concluded that the language of the Sermon on the Mount is not proclamation. It is the didache, meaning it is teaching. Okay? what difference does that make? This is what he says, to paraphrase Jeremiah's. Okay? The Sermon on the Mount is what you and I are gradually capable of if and only if you have first received the grace of God in proclamation and made it real in your life, right? And because this is Didache teaching, Jesus is now putting forward for you what your life can become more of if you let the grace of God come into your life and practice and express that grace more and more in your life. You don't covet as much anymore because your values have changed. You don't need to lust as much anymore because our affections are in a different place, and on and on and on and on. That is Jeremiah's interpretation, which I think is a pretty decent one, right? In other words, this is not a condition for grace. It is an expression of a person who has experienced grace moving more and more towards this life. Does it make sense? And I love that interpretation. I mean, not everybody, and N.T. Wright doesn't agree with it, but it's a pretty good one, right? It's, like I said, more compelling from the perspective of moral formation. So we make a distinction, of course, from receiving grace, right? If you let moral formation, let that grace become more and more expressed in your life, according to Jeremiah's, this Sermon on the Mount life becomes more and more reflective of your life. Does it make sense? So there is a perspective of development rather than, is it law to follow or not to follow? Well, that's not the best way to understand the rules and the commands in the Bible. God gives you the initial ones, but also tells you this is the place to, this is your destination, this is the roadmap for you to follow. Which is why discipleship and moral formation is the heart of the Christian faith, to help people move from place to place until we get there. But not as a condition to receive God's love, but as a response to God's love. See the difference? Okay? But I'll check with Dr. Brown, to find out if that is what she thinks of Jeremiah's. But anyway, let's move on. Let me go through this very quickly. Now, the connection between grace and character. Remember earlier on we said, if we are saved by grace, why do we need to work so hard? Right? After. So I gave you three views. I just put those words there because I couldn't think of better ways to understand this. I call the first one the elementary grace view, which says, if we are saved by grace, isn't building character self-effort? It feels like hard work and hard discipline. So are we saved by faith through grace, or grace through faith alone, or not alone? So that is the elementary view of grace. The second one is the religious character view, which is, or the moralistic view, using self-discipline and work to prove myself to God. Remember the rich young ruler? This is what I have accomplished for God. So it's like the older brother of the prodigal son. I have been faithful to you all these years. The focus is always on me, what I have done. That's the moralistic view. The third one is the magical view of maturity. This is when I've heard some Christians say, let's see, now that I've converted and I've become a follower of Christ, it is the Holy Spirit who comes upon me and changes me, right? I don't have to do anything, I just respond. But here's the problem. What is the Holy Spirit doing versus what I'm doing? I cannot tell the difference. That's why I call this the magical view. Simply by invoking the name of the Holy Spirit does not specify what is changing in our lives. It's too magical. It sounds like magic, David Copperfield, you go to Las Vegas and all of that, bada bing, bada boom, you're a changed person. How? I don't know. So if you don't know how you change, you cannot improve in a way. You need to know how to change in order to improve. Okay, so biblical response. in your notes, we are saved through faith by an infinite grace that produces our deep responses towards character development. Okay? I'm just finding different ways to say the same thing, as you can guess, right? Just to build a deeper understanding among all of us. So Ephesians 2, verse 8 to 10, you see how God puts it together, or Paul puts it together. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. See, we are so familiar with this text, and then the next verse goes in the opposite direction. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God has prepared for us in advance to do. So we already know. So when you see the word good works, that is another name for moral formation or character development. Okay? That is what comes after. It's a divine partnering. Or the way Luther puts it, we are saved by grace alone. By a grace that is not alone. Okay? And I like the way John puts it. Look at John 1:16. For of his fullness we have received, and grace upon grace. You receive grace. With the character formation, the grace just keeps pouring in. Okay? I like to see it, if you would ask me what image one can use, it's like a leaking can. God wants to keep pouring blessings into our lives, but then we are a vessel that leaks. Moral formation is the process of patching up the holes. Okay? So more can come in. So character deepens and multiplies grace in our lives because God wants to keep pouring grace upon grace. All right? All right. So the third one, how then do we cultivate, the most important question, how then do we cultivate this grace in our lives? Because remember what we said earlier on, we always say, be more like Christ. Next time respond, how? That's the one we don't ask or don't know how to answer. How do we become? Right? Because we already know it. On the surface, it sounds like a platitude. Be like Christ and all of that. Explain to me how. Okay, the first one is it is acquired through the daily habits and choices that we make. Right? Many of you already know the fruits of the Spirit, so we don't have to go through all of them, okay? Fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. Do you realize that this is probably the only list or objective list to measure a person's maturity? It's not how many persons a person can save out there. Notice that that is not a KPI or key performance indicator in the Bible, in the New Testament. These are the objective measures, and they're all character evaluators. So, you can be better at preaching, teaching, garner more PhDs, have 5 instead of 3 ministries, right? Converted 10 instead of 5 persons. And yet, what is the measure God uses? Has your love been increasing? Or your joy been increasing? Whatever notch you are on right now, has it increased by 1 notch since the last season? Love, joy, peace, patience, more patient? Are you a kinder person? Is your theology improved? Notice that all of those are really important. And yet, the KPI or key performance indicator that Paul uses is a character version. It's a character measure within a person, right? Fruit or character, right? So, very often Christians like to talk about the fruit of the Spirit. But if you ask the question, what is the root of the Spirit? It's grace. Grace produces the fruit, right? And if you look at the fruit, you begin to ask, okay, Paul is using a metaphor that requires what? If you're talking about fruit, you need a cultivator. It doesn't happen magically, right? You need a gardener. Just like Jesus is the gardener of grace in our lives, we also become the gardener of character fruits in our lives. So you need a gardener who takes the trouble to till the ground, prepare, fertilize, nourish and water. What else? Fruits grow gradually, like character. It takes time. Fruits also grow from the inside out. No matter how much you shout at it, it won't speed up because it grows from the inside out, which is what character is, an internal trait, right? It's an internal affair. So, whatever we practice becomes our second nature. Did you all get to read the book by N.T. Wright? Now I'll just pivot over to that to highlight some of the things that he mentioned over there. He gives the example of the even neuroscientists who noticed that why is it taxi drivers in London, right? Drivers in London, for some reason, have a bigger hippocampus, right? At the back of the brain, right? Because unlike other streets around the world, in London it is the most complex in the world because of the twists and turns and many one-way streets. So taxi drivers, this is of course before Uber, right? Before Uber, you need to take those exams to know the fastest way to get to a destination with one-way streets all around you. And they found out, the neuroscientists did, that the taxi drivers and the cabbies had bigger hippocampuses than a regular person, because regular practice of a particular habit changes even the brain, right? I thought, wow, that is really interesting. What else? Have you ever wondered then why? Some people have wondered about this, especially if you are a Christian. You look at the Old Testament, why on earth is it full of rituals? You notice the Old Testament's full of rituals? Morning this, afternoon this, evening this, certain day this, Sabbath this. Rituals. Because coming to God on a regular basis makes you better in your relationship with Him. Praying at more systematic moments in the day, done over and over again, changes you. That's the point of habits. The Old Testament has been full of this for the longest time and we couldn't figure out why. We thought it was overly rigid. No, it understands human nature. Why do we tithe? Because we're generous? No! By tithing, we become generous people. How do you become generous? By practicing giving. The Bible's more realistic about human nature. You train your children to give even though they say, no, you better give or else. But the more they do it in 5-10 years, it becomes natural. That's the point of rituals. Switch the word habits for rituals. The Bible is full of it for a reason. Habits change us. Right? Why always worshiping God? And I tell it to my congregants when they come on Sunday morning. Many of you may not even feel like worshiping God. But when you raise your hands and worship God when you don't feel like it, you're not being a hypocrite. You're a person of character. Why? What is a hypocrite? A hypocrite is a person who believes one thing and does something else. Right? But if you go to church, for example, and you don't feel like worshiping, but you know you ought to and you raise your hands anyway, you're not a hypocrite. You're a person of character. You're practicing something that you know you ought to do, but you frankly don't feel like it. So don't confuse being a hypocrite versus a person of character who wants to cultivate practices that changes you along the way. See the difference between the two? That's the point of ritual. That is why we worship God intentionally. That is why, as Hebrews say, they gather together as often as possible. Because by gathering together, it changes you and your relationships. You improve relationships by engaging with real people, not by theorizing about them. See how it works? You become better at cycling by actually cycling. You don't learn swimming by theorizing and just watching YouTube videos. You do it by actually swimming. By swimming, you learn swimming. In the same way, you appreciate music by doing what? Listening to music. That's the point. Isn't it interesting? Lately, if you look at the New York Times bestseller list, the books so many of them have to do with habits. Let me give you some examples. Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. He's been on a New York Times bestseller list. His other books are Matthew Syed's Bounce. I put all of those books and those references in your notes, right? They give the example of Matthew Syed's book Bounce. He talks about a place in England, Reading, where that's a place that contains more table tennis champions than the rest of England put together, because in that environment they do nothing but play table tennis until they are so good at it, right? It's the environment of rituals that you get yourself into. And then the magic number, they say 10,000 hours. You do that long enough, that becomes who you are, right? And then another book called Daily Rituals. See, those books are out there, but we have one that contains all of that for the longest time. Example, the book Daily Rituals, it talks about examples of people on the cutting edge in their fields, like Beethoven. He had his ritual of waking up 8:30, right, writing his stuff, and he would finish by 2:30. Or even Stephen King, right? Every day he would write his books, whether it's his birthday and all of that, but he would end at 1:30. So here's the paradox. Here's the paradox, as that writer writes. All of the innovators that you find, the pioneers and the groundbreakers and the trailblazers who formulate these new ideas, interestingly enough, in their personal lives, they are all ritualized and routine. The better we are at habits and rituals and routines, we become even more creative people. The stronger the rituals. And so, as the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, people tend to think that what separates religious people from the rest of the world is our belief system. Well, that is actually only half the story. Because in the Judeo-Christian faith, we are supposed to behave differently. It's not just believe differently, but behave differently. What's the difference? They engage in rituals. Religious people engage in rituals. In other words, all great achievement requires ritual, right? Now, do you understand why among any religious groups in the world, the Jews dominate every academic field out there? As I mentioned probably before, 36% of them are Nobel Prize winners. Look at all the helping sciences. Psychiatry, psychology, look at the names. Movie makers, look at their names. They're all Jews. Why are they so disproportionately creative in the world? Answer: rituals. Great civilizations have come and gone. Assyrian Empire, Roman Empire, the Greek Empire. And here is one small little group of people where the population of the Jews today is smaller than the statistical era of the population of China. Right? That is the population of the Jews. Smaller than the statistical era of the population of China, yet they have an outsized influence in the world. Many would attribute that to rituals, habits, which the Christian faith began to adopt from the Jews also. To understand moral formation, we become who we are because of the rituals in our lives. So I hope you don't mind me just borrowing from secular examples, just to overemphasize the power and the place of moral formation in our lives. Okay, there's another reason why. This one I learned from the Jews. Why we have rituals and habits in our lives. It's in your notes. Spiritual habits or church and personal rituals bring our peak experiences of God into our daily routines. That is one of the biggest reasons why. Okay? You probably know where I'm going with this. It is possible for the Christian to go to spiritual retreats, seminars, what have you, conventions. We have this in our church too. We send our younger ones to a band and all of the great stuff, InterVarsity, whatever. And what happens to them? They come back on fire, right? You learn the best things and all of that stuff. But why is it they fizzle off? Because we call that peak experiences, right? So, what is the point of rituals? What rituals do is to take peak experiences and routinizes them. Does it make sense? It routinizes peak experiences so that your peak experiences becomes divided into everyday life, high or low. They get spread out. In the next point, spiritually high episodes do not build Christian maturity, but consistent habits over a long season, they do. Okay? So, which is why, as we said many times, you can have Christians in the church who have had marvelous relationships with Jesus and all of that, and then boom, they flatten out. Why? Because peak experiences do not transform a person in the long term. That's how we started this afternoon by. All right? And I remember my Pentecostal days. Slain in the spirit, we fell down on the ground, we were speaking in tongues. Part of our ministry was casting out demons, praying for the sick, seeing them healed. And yet, years later, seeing the same people, some walked away from the faith. And I was wondering, what happened? You were casting out demons, now you can't even connect with God. Right? What happened? Peak experiences do not transform a person's character. It's moral formation that does.